the series Democracy Promotion After Afghanistan by the European Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building at Hertie School of Governance. And tonight we will continue our discussion about Eastern Europe, of course, motivated by the recent events, but we're going to take a little bit of a broader angle. So we are going to discuss oil, resource curse, rentier states, and organized crime as government. Because the two guests that we have in fact been writing quite a lot on these topics, and in fact also engaging in activism on these topics. Because as we have taken the habit, we like to show you individuals who are more than academics, people who are also have a career of public stance in their countries or abroad or national or on international issue. And of course, you know, we're gender neutral, but it seems to me that we have shown quite a significant number of women, and we will continue to do so. So the two academics that and activists that we have tonight are Professor Louise Shelley from George Mason University, where she chairs a center which is dedicated actually to the study of terrorism and organized crime. And Louise is an expert on post-Soviet affairs. So she started as a Sovietologist, but then she has now a global experience in illicit finance, in organized crime, and in terrorism. And she's among the first individuals whom I've heard in international environment more than 15 years ago, actually speaking against criminal infiltration from Russia and against the Western vulnerability to money laundering and other issues which have become very topical these days. Now, Leila Alieva, I think I know even for more years than I have known Louise, because we have been together in a project when we were all very hopeful that European enlargement will continue to the east, you know, until we meet Russia. And even with Russia, you know, there were some optimists who thought that maybe Russia will want to join one day the European Union. So Leila was at the time a scholar living in Azerbaijan, where she chaired a think tank. Meanwhile, the political situation there became difficult. And now she lives basically as a scholar in exile. Of course, you know, she's a scholar in Oxford, and she's currently at the Bosch Academy in Berlin. So she definitely, you know, is invited in the best places, but she is still a democracy activist who has to live abroad. And this is another topic that we're going to touch today, the situation of oppositions living in countries which undergo this kind of war mobilization. Now, let me start with Louise, because I was years ago struck by her article where she tried to argue that the authoritarian regime of Russia is an unusual species of authoritarian regime. It's actually organized crime in government. Now, Louise, what do you mean by that? And is this a special variant of authoritarianism, or we should consider all authoritarian states to be basically organized crime in government?
When I started writing this in the early 1990s, I was seeing the rise of organized crime after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the continuation, well, the collapse of a one-party state. So what we had was the emergence of organized crime as the property owners, because in other societies, there's a large private economy, like in Italy. But what happened in the Soviet Union was that all state-owned property was then sold at the end of the Soviet Union, and organized crime having the assets and after prohibition, and also having the violence to keep away other purchasers, became major investors in the Russian and many other post-Soviet state economies. And what is also significant is that what we have now when we're talking about kleptocrats is that some of these kleptocrats started out as members of organized crime, and some of the kleptocrats acquired their wealth by partnering with organized crime. So this is an unusual relationship. Maybe you can see this in some countries like Colombia, where individuals who are part of organized crime are now regional elites. But what you're seeing in Russia today is these individuals who had coalitions or even were part of organized crime have risen to positions of great wealth.
Right. And how does, somebody who wants to have absolute control like Putin coexist with these networks, with these gangs, with these criminal networks? How does this work?
I mean, Putin has had contacts with these networks when he was in St. Petersburg. But in the early 1990s and up till the time that Putin came into office, the organized crime was predominant. And as the state began to reassert its authority, the organized crime became subservient to the state. They're still there, but they're very much having to follow the state's orders.
So he basically enrolled them, right? I think there is actually a book by Françoise Thomam about Putinism, which argues the same, that Putin managed to organize, to enroll basically all these organizations, which started by being more like gangs. In fact, I think she traces this back to the prison culture in early Soviet, in early post-Soviet times. And she argues that from prison culture, it actually became quite established, and quite a large number of these networks, in fact, in order to survive, made the pact with the government, and they are now serving the government. But how does this affect the relations with Ukraine? I mean, after all, Ukraine is also a post-Soviet country. Ukraine also had oligarchs. It's a bit strange that this day we don't hear anything about Ukrainian oligarchs and about Ukrainian corruption anymore.
Well, it was certainly very present. What's very different, and I was already writing in about the late 1990s and early 2000s about what was different between Ukraine and Russia. They both had organized crime, they had kleptocrats, but Ukraine had much more civil society, and it had a much more engaged citizenry on every issue that I was looking at, whether it was countering human trafficking, whether it was looking at corruption, and that's what was very different. While in Russia, you did not have this flourishing of civil society.
Right. Leila, can I put the question to Azerbaijan? I mean, would you say that this group which leads up, this clan which leads Azerbaijan, which is very notorious, would you say that there are elements of organized crime? Is this comparable in any way with Russia?
Organized crime, well, at least the Pandora Papers and White Papers, I think they all have the reference to the family. And well, whether it's comparable or not, it's hard to say, but I think what unites two is that they're both, Russia and Azerbaijan, are rentier states, which means that substantial revenues produced in the country, they're coming from the external rents, from the oil and gas sector, and which unfortunately creates disincentive of taxes, tax collection, and makes the government independent and unaccountable to the populace, to the people and society, which of course creates enormous opportunities for illicit trafficking, money laundering, and misappropriation of state funds. In Azerbaijan, there is an even greater amount of state. The Sokar oil company is state-owned, and that creates particular special sort of conditions for the non-transparency and misappropriation.
Well, can you explain to us a little bit more? How does the fact that the income of Azerbaijan comes so much for oil creates disincentives for tax collection? And are you talking only about incentives for the government, or there are also
it's a definition of rentier state, and the major effect with any rentier state, which forms its revenues not at the expense of the real sector of economy, but at the expense of rents. That sort of allows the elite, or what represents the state, to be independent from the constituencies and live at the expense of these rents, because usually these rents are accrued directly to the government or to the state. Because whatever is, usually the natural resources, they belong to the state, or they are under control of the government or whoever represents the government. So these rents are accrued directly to the state, and that means that there is a disincentive for them to have this connection between the constituency, which exists in every functioning democratic state, that the state functions at the expense of this connection between the populace and the state or the government through the tax collection.
Right. So is the fact that these two governments are so strongly dependent on natural resources, what is actually the connection leading to this external aggression and to the fact that we have seen in the last year? I mean, everybody is only speaking of the Ukrainian war these days, but it was quite a surprise, however, for many people when this Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict defroze last year, because it had been frozen for quite a significant number of years. So what happens? I mean, why are this, oil rents not enough? Why the need to solve conflicts, regardless who is right or who is wrong in this conflict? Because it's really complicated. These are post-Soviet borders. These are borders created by Stalin. They're very complicated borders. For people who do not know the region, it's quite difficult to understand what a kind of time bomb was placed to all these successor Soviet states by the fact that borders are, exactly as Stalin designed them. So why did we come to conflict in the last year? Why didn't this oil economy just, kept us going? Why aren't these people just happy to get money out of oil and go on, buy people instead of killing people?
Well, I wouldn't say that we've been without conflict. I mean, think of what went on in Chechnya and the total devastation, carpet bombing of Chechnya, just as we're seeing in Kharkiv, in Mariupol today. Then we've had the Russians being involved in Syria, and we've had Russians involved in Kazakhstan recently, but that wasn't very violent, but they sent forces involved in Azerbaijan and Armenia. So this is not something new. This has been going on, this violent application of force. We're just paying more attention to it now because we're looking at it in a country on the border with Europe with 40 million people. And the visibility of this is so great. So, and the shock value and the fact that the Russians haven't taken over and succeeded in a few days, and that this is a prolonged conflict, has certainly raised international awareness. But what happens with oil economies is that you have a high tendency for oil economies and natural resource dependent economies to lead to autocrats, and with authoritarian rule and long-term authoritarian rule, we go back to that great British expression of absolute rule corrupts absolutely. And that's what we're seeing today, is an enormous consequence of this corruption and oligarchical rule that has been dominant for over 2 decades.
I agree with Louise, because if you remember in the 90s, there was an organization, regional organization, security organization created called Guam, which united Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova due to the common security concerns vis-à-vis Russia. They all suffered the secessionist conflicts, which were used by Russia, Russian military in particular, in order to establish her control in these countries. And these organizations united 4 countries with a similar security concerns. They were very, their interests were common because they cared about their sovereignty and the violation of their internationally recognized borders. So in case of Azerbaijan, I would say they've been fighting the same war as Ukrainians been fighting in terms of protecting their borders and their sovereignty. Because for 30 years, 20% of the territory of Azerbaijan was under occupation, which was made by Armenian army together with help of the Russian army. And this unfortunately led to an enormous flow of, it was ethnic cleansing and enormous flow of IDPs, more than 600,000. So there was a humanitarian emergency which has never been addressed, either by international organizations, multilateral, I mean, UN resolutions were adopted, but they were not addressed at all. So I think that's the reason why this particular conflict erupted nowadays. It should probably have erupted one day or another, because there was a sort of lack of any action from the side of the international community in addressing these issues of humanitarian emergencies and mass displacement and things like that. So, but on the other hand, you know, timing is interesting indeed. Timing is COVID period, when I think the countries are distracted from many issues. We're focusing on COVID. And I think that creates a bit of sort of conducive environment. On the other hand, you know, any war, regardless whether it's taking place in democratic or non-democratic country, it usually helps the leader to boost its rating. So I think for the time being, at least when that was happening in Azerbaijan, the opposition and you know, the government, they agreed not to, for the time being, not to criticize each other, but to unite for the common national interest. So it sort of bought some time for the leader of the country in terms of the stability and you know, preservation of the status quo.
I think there's something also building on what Leila said. Azerbaijan has had enormous continuity in its leadership. There hasn't been a leadership change, but in Armenia, there was a leadership change in which there was a leader focused on anti-corruption, which Putin always finds very threatening. We've seen Zelensky focusing on anti-corruption and not being a pro-Russian leader. And I know, and I hear from people connected to Moldova, that there's enormous anxiety and that they were next because they've had a very forceful young leader who is anti-corruption. And so I think that how the country is voting, the type of leaders that are coming into office have an enormous impact on Putin's mentality. And when someone comes in and the population is supporting cleaner government, youthful leadership, a move away from autocracy and more independence from Russia, that's when Putin comes in. These are enormous threats to his, not only his sense of empire, but if he has a surrogate there that's loyal to him, he doesn't act militarily. But if there's somebody there with a force of independence backed by the citizenry, this is like a powder keg for him.
Right. So Russia basically invades countries when they lose elections, when they no longer are able to manipulate elections and put some sort of a surrogate, as you say. And that's the situation of Ukraine, and that's why Moldova is afraid. And yes, in the Armenian or Azerbaijan conflict, it is worth saying that Armenia holds elections, and at least their last elections have very good reputation, that they brought a government which really wants to do reforms and to fight against corruptions. And also Russians didn't defend them in this last conflict. I think many people expected that the Russians will defend it, but they did not. So in fact, it's rather being a democracy or turning towards a democracy, and in particular, in a democracy which fights money laundering, which fights kleptocracy. It's really a risk factor for countries in this part of the world. But all this, however, I must say, seems strangely rational to me, by a way of explaining Russian behavior. And I wanted to ask Leila, because I know she has a degree in psychology, actually from Moscow, right? I have a degree of psychology too, long lost in my past. So that's why I was amused to see yours. What do you think of this explanation that we see a lot these days in the media, that Putin is actually suffering from some mental affliction, and this is why he has done all that? Do you think there is some merit in this explanation? And is this explanation helping us find some way of a solution? It's all irrational, and we're gonna be out of it once we get rid of Putin?
It's a good question, an interesting question. Well, first of all, we can't say anything about the health unless we have the results of the test in our hands. At least that's what I'm used to. You can, of course, guess, and by various expressions of his behavior. But again, I wouldn't trust just the observation unless I pass or conduct the test on the personality intactness and other tests. So in this regard, it doesn't matter. What matters, however, is why deterrence is not working in the international relations, because dictators in general have a tendency to the pathology of personality. Most of them have this extreme craving for recognition and control, for which they are ready to take high risks, pathologically focus on their own interests at the expense of the others. They're very often called narcissistic personalities. So there might be a border personality, there might be personality disorder. But what is important, why in history, we encounter the same issue. I mean, that happened in the 40s, for instance, and we still are not prepared. The system of international relations is not prepared to deal with the cases like this. I mean, what went wrong with Putin? Probably he was misreading certain messages and signs which was coming to him from the international community. He picked up as he saw vulnerable target, Ukraine. He thought he would get away from this, with this, because, America has done it before with much more distantly located countries. He miscalculated, because that's also the part of narcissistic personality, that they create their own reality and believe it. So he miscalculated the decisiveness of Ukrainians' and sense of identity, and their being resolute to fight for their independence. So, as I said, the dictators might be restrained by checks and balances, but it's important to draw the conclusion or learn the lesson that, it's yet another time the world is dealing with a person who has this lust for destruction and control, and there are no deterring factors and mechanisms which would be successful in this regard. So I think that's where we are now.
Well, I think it is worth telling people. So first, I want to encourage people also to use the chat button. Please go ahead, and we're following questions. And if you want to send, resources and to put references, you can do this. You can also ask questions, and we'll make a selection, and we'll pick the most interesting one at the end. What I wanted to say is that as a young psychologist, I had to assist in a number of forensic examinations, which were the kind of pre-trial decisions if a criminal, of somebody who was actually an alleged criminal, who was presented for trial, had a sound judgment and could differentiate between good or bad. All right. So we should tell people that all these personality disorders that you mentioned in talking with Putin, they're not real sickness. So somebody with such a personality disorder would definitely be found to have a sound judgment, to differentiate good or bad, and would be able to stand trial. All right, even if it were be for a smaller crime. We're not having any evidence to consider Putin, with some sort of major affliction, except a personality disorder. And yes, of course, that is really very dangerous, but it's also very widespread. People have to understand that this is really very, very widespread. People who simply are so selfish that they are able to inflict a lot of harm of people around just to meet their ends. Well, anyway, definitely we're not going to be able to treat Putin, right? Or remove Putin by way of mental affliction. So I think that people who expect that this will, somehow grow into something, don't really, will be disappointed. So next to that, what can we do to dry resources, that this kind of resources that the rentier states draw upon? And do we do enough? I mean, we have taken unprecedented steps, so the Western countries, but is this enough? Is this meeting the recommendations that you have met in the past, Louise? Let's just start first, let's go first money laundering, and then we're going to discuss about resources from oil and gas. Okay, what about money laundering? Are we now a little bit better sheltered from compared to a few years ago when laundromats were really ravaging Western banks?
I mean, the situation is better, but it's not good enough. And speaking from my own country, we've passed certain measures, but we still have just this enormous hole in our legislation, which is called beneficial ownership. And we do not have proper legislation on beneficial ownership. So what does this mean? So while we're trying to sanction these oligarchs in the United States and elsewhere, they've set up shell companies or offshore companies, and we do not know who is behind these companies. So you can't go after their money because you can't find out who is there. And we now have plans to set up a registry of beneficial ownership. But this registry is going to be closed and will only be accessible to law enforcement. Therefore, researchers like ourselves, journalists, even businesses, if they want to know that whether they should be dealing with this company or not, will not have access to these registries. So there's still absolutely gaping holes in our financial system in terms of art, in terms of real estate, in terms of the ability to invest in hedge funds, venture capital, gold, minerals. That means that our system, and there's a very prominent part of money laundering called trade-based money laundering, which is especially relevant for Russia because its economy is based not on production like China, but on trade of oil, gas, minerals, gold. So yes, we've made improvements, but we have not produced a financial system, a global financial system that's transparent enough to really stop and get at this oligarchical and corrupt capital that's housed outside of Russia. And Russia is distinctive in how much of its personally held assets are held outside of Russia.
Okay, so United States should pass this legislation, let's say. And what about Europe? I mean, I think that when I listen to
Well, it's not
Americans,
just, wait a second, it's not passing this legislation. This legislation has been proposed and it's been watered down by lobbyists working on top of the real estate industry, working on top of for the art market. So it's not just a simple thing. It is our corruption and financial interests that are preventing a transparent financial environment that allows these oligarchs and corrupt individuals to thrive.
okay, so it's very similar to the UK situation, where some steps were taken, but it's far weaker steps, seeing the extraordinary infiltration of oligarchs that they had in the UK. Now, unfortunately, I must tell you that in Germany, where we are, also this beneficial ownership law is considered to be really very, very unsatisfactory. It's been an old recommendation of UNCAC Review Coalition and of Greco. So that seems to be a very difficult condition to meet. Also, there is official involvement. I mean, what I ask myself these days is what happened with companies which have direct interest in Russia. I mean, they're not necessarily big companies, but in Saxony, in East Germany, for instance, I mean, I think it's a significant number of companies. I think it's 1 in 5 companies or something like this, which has trade partners in Russia. I mean, since they were in East Germany, that was their capital, connections with Russia. And that is why Germany is so reluctant to do certain things, because it's a part of the economy, which is not a criminal economy. I think it is a normal economy, but which is very, very closely tied with Russia. So what is the solution to that? They will have to tell these people to reorient themselves overnight, and that's not an easy thing.
No, probably, I think we need, first of all, diversification of the sources of energy, which I think if we look at the countries like, Russia, the source of power there is the revenues from oil and gas sector. So in order to undermine the power, you undermine the sources of income. And that means, but it takes two to have it, because the rents are external. So they're coming from outside, which means that you can't really expect something happening inside the country without addressing the, the mechanism outside, internationally and in the other countries. So it's very interrelated, as Louise just mentioned and said, system. So it should be addressed simultaneously. And as I said, first, in the 90s, the diversification was a hit. And I think Azerbaijan was one of the key actors in this regard, diversification of the West's dependence on Russian energy went through this famous Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan route. But for the time being, I think European Union was sort of pacified, and only now, 30 years after, that diversification sort of very high level game or whatever, geopolitical game there. Only now, after this war, they came to conclusion, like Germany, that we have to diversify the sources of our energy supply to be less dependent on Russia. So it's one of the.
Okay, but is this real diversification? Dictator with another dictator. If we, if now the rush is to go to Azerbaijan or to Saudi Arabia or to another Gulf state, I mean, is this really better? Are we really helping democracy in these countries by giving more rents?
Well, it's a temporary, right? It's a temporary, of course, solution, because the new transition we entered, as it was announced everywhere, that we entered the energy transition era, which means that a lot of countries are now making decision to transfer from the non-renewable to the renewable resources. And, that transfer will take time. And I think this diversification in the meantime will probably play some role for a while. But it's amazing. I mean, I went to Georgia recently and I saw many of my friends already have electrical cars, the businessmen. And so it's becoming a really hype. It's a very sort of quickly developing trend. Well, at least that's what I witnessed.
Yeah, well, let's hope. But, I mean, that's just a middle class thing. It's trendy for us to look green, but the industry is not going to move on batteries very soon. And everybody who's like really a big consumer of energy, those are the real gap. So, Louise, what should we do more about drying the Russian rents from which they sustain this war?
I think we need, first of all, as I was saying, greater transparency in the global financial system. And I think when you just talk about clean energy in the United States, there's enormous growth in clean energy. And it hasn't been talked enough about, but it has been very significant, even continuing under Trump when he didn't provide financial benefits for it, and it's ongoing. So I think there's much more that Europe and the rest of the world could do, and also in the developing world as well, in terms of renewable energy. And I think we need to be also focusing on enablers. And these are my colleague Frank Vogel wrote a very good book recently on enablers. There have been others who've been writing on it. And we have to make it less attractive financially, reputationally, and legally to be participating in this money laundering. At this moment, not only do we not have in the United States beneficial owner laws, but we don't have a requirement that real estate agents and brokers report on suspicious financial transactions. So we have gaping holes in the system, and we have to go after the professionals. And there are certainly a strong feeling now in this environment where people, for the first time, understand visually, as they see on the nightly news, the bombings of children and women and hospitals and schools, what it means for a kleptocratic society to act against its peaceful neighbor. And all of these ideas about responsibility were all very abstract ideas, but now they're not abstract anymore. And that's, I think, very, very important in changing the public consciousness. And so I think there is a moment in which we all have a responsibility, and you who work in and help lead an anti-corruption community like I do in the United States, to take and get this message, not just out to the like-minded, but to do public outreach in radio shows, educating journalists who are writing stories that are accessible to ordinary people, and make them make this connection between the horror that they're seeing of war, that they haven't seen images like this for 70 years, except out of horror images of World War II. I mean, horrible images in Europe. They've occurred elsewhere. And explain how this is linked to a corrupt financial system. And this is going on, and I don't think it's going to stop. And I think that's one of the most encouraging developments, is not to just talk about the military and the need for force, but the need to go after the financial system that facilitates this. I don't think it's a cure to this problem, as we talked about with the problem of Putin and his desire to win and never back down. But it's very important for the future of the world for us to be cleaning up our financial system so we don't have these future efforts. Just yesterday, I got an email from somebody who's going to set up, a kleptocrat tour of Washington. And these are not just Deripaska's mansions, but it's the African dictators that have bought land or houses and property around. So I think there's a growing awareness that this is linked not just to Russia, but it's part of a broader problem. But the aggressiveness that they've seen from Russia is bringing this home in a way that people have never understood before.
So that would be a good part of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, right? That it helps us clean the West a little bit. But let's see, you know, I mean, it's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. I heard the London tour of kleptocrats, which took people to mansions and actually to universities up to Oxford and Cambridge, where there were chairs endowed by Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs. The tour was very popular, but until the war, there was absolutely no action. And even now, I haven't heard anybody to decline Russian or any kind of oligarchic money from universities. So yes, let's hope that, and of course we should support the media, give them evidence. But all this is very long-term solution, right? All this is again raising awareness and pushing open these doors which are now ajar due to the war. But the question is really, is there anything that we can do more in the short and medium term to stop this? And now I turn to this discussion about oppositions. You know, oppositions are probably not feeling very well in this environment of national mobilization. But in the same time, I think a lot of hope is pinned on internal opposition to these regimes. Now, is this a realistic hope, Leila? Do you think that oppositions can have a chance in these countries?
Opposition was seriously weakened in these oil-rich states. It exists, but it's weakened. And if you look at the other rentier states, you will notice that very often, particularly recently, in all these, mass protest movements and attempts of the revolutions or, changes, mass changes, it's not the opposition which organizes the groups. So usually these are networks. These have to do something with social networks, It's even very often not individual leadership, but this is a group leaderships. So I think the forms of resistance and rebellion is changing, but the opposition definitely is an important institution which needs support. And it's not only, I would like to add that it's not only about, shadow business deals between the West and the countries rich with oil. It's even the compromising the democracy promotion agenda for the sake of the energy interests in these countries. For instance, in Azerbaijan, very often you would see the official representatives coming to Baku, meeting with the government, but rarely with opposition, unlike they would do it in Georgia and in Armenia, because they didn't want to upset the government, or they didn't want, that's not the way to do things. I mean, then we should not be surprised that, Azerbaijan ended up in dynastic transfer of power or something like that, because all the sort of actions of the international community before were leading to this outcome exactly because there was no recognition that trade with dictators has political consequences. And if this is EU or this is the US, they should be aware of these political consequences, and they should actually be even more sensitive to the issue of, opposition and other groups. So I think it's not just the illicit sort of deals and illegal business, but it's even at the level of and that's what Putin is relying on. He's relying on the weaknesses, what he considers weaknesses of the West is pragmatism. He considers it's pragmatism. Very often he would even bring the argument, I mean, you don't like this, but we have, like 500 companies from the UK, from other, European state. They are operating, in Russia. So this pragmatism is used by Putin as the weakness of the West. And so that's the eventual result we come to.
I think we need to think about dissent and opposition in much broader terms than, the thousands of protesters that have been arrested in Russia today. And in our discussion of what's the dynamics of the Russian economy and oligarchs, we don't talk enough about this phenomenon that's called corporate raiding, which is an enormous impediment to entrepreneurship in Russia. And corporate raiding is a phenomenon in which the Siloviki, the people in the power ministries, with those with political power and the oligarchs, take over the businesses of other business people. And these businesses can be relatively small, but they also could be a business of $500 million, where somebody's son owns the competitive, a very powerful individual, like the head of Sberbank. His son owns a business that's a competitor, and he works the system so that his son can take over this competitor's business for $500 million without paying anything for it. What is interesting is that organized crime is used to provide violence against these individuals, but the state has done this. An official statistic of Titov, the ombudsman of Russia, is that in 2020, there were 200,000 Russian businessmen who were placed in jail while their businesses were being taken over. So these are not your people marching in the streets, but these are people formerly of position in their communities, formerly of wealth and successful people, but exposure and months, and some of them have spent a year in a Russian prison, which is or jail, which is just a horrible experience, has made a sort of large force of opposition that nobody's talking about. And so this is another piece that we need to be thinking about, not just the Navalny supporters of anti-corruption, but this terribly alienated and threatened business community. And so that's another piece.
Organized. You have to be organized to count as an opposition. I think that these people were absolutely terrified, okay, because all these raid schemes that you are describing are possible only because there is complicity of law enforcement. So you really need to have a state which operates as an organized crime, where judges would put them in jail, prosecutors would indict them, policemen would arrest them. And I think these people are very scared, and sometimes they prefer to lose their businesses, but just to get out of jail. I mean, is there any sign, is there any objective evidence that these business people who are extorted are organizing into some form of opposition?
There have been some citizen organizations, but I think as we begin to see, and there's some evidence that some people in the power structures are seeing this war go so badly. So there are parts of the military that are seeing, 10,000 deaths, large civilian casualties. We're going to be seeing some people who are going to become less supportive of this regime as this death and destruction goes on. And it's not going to happen immediately, but there are reports that there are already cracks in certain parts of the system. I'm not sure that it's going to come out of the FSB, the structure that's been Putin's chief area of support, but it may come out of the military. There have been so many generals who've been killed. The humiliation of Russia on the battlefield, this has not happened before. So
yeah, Chubais, I think, also has already left the government. Chubais left the government, today.
He left the country.
Yeah.
So, but he's not the inner circle. But there are people power, closer to power that I think are beginning to ask questions. There are indications of this.
So basically, we're expecting the opposition to come from within the power circles. We expect cracks within the regime. We don't expect the Democrats actually to take over, but we hope that people who are, in the upper circles are going to split over this. That's the hope.
I mean, I think it's the reality of what has happened in the past. I mean, as I, think about Stalin, he had what I would call an expedited death. And this leaves a power vacuum for something to change. It's not as if we've ever had a force of democracy taking over Russia, but you've had people like Gorbachev come in who become engines of change. And I mean, at this moment, I do not see a democratic opposition mobilizing, but I see fissures within as Russia is not winning as it expected to win.
Right. I mean, God knows that they tried. I mean, I was impressed how many people actually started to demonstrate in protests, since it's really very dangerous to protest.
Yes,
so I think
absolutely.
It was impressive turnout. But the question really is, I mean, speaking of this, democracy promotion, which these talks are dedicated to, all right, and we're trying to speak neutrally of democracy promotion. Maybe some of the democracy promotion that we did was really very offensive to these regimes and was perceived as a threat. So maybe it backfired, and we actually endangered the security of the people that we were trying to help. The question is there anything that we can do? Is there anything that we can do for Democrats in this point of time to help them, even, if we don't take the short term, if we take the medium term, what kind of regime can come after Putin? I mean, if we plan like in Zimbabwe, that Putin is going to be succeeded by the head of the Secret Service, that's really not much of a hope, it seems to me. I mean, is there anything that we can do as outsiders to help and support internal opposition in times of this patriotic mobilization, which is so difficult?
I think it's very important that there be alternative sources of information, and that people, it's hard at this moment, but with the internet, being closed off and sources of information, but I think we need to be thinking about how do you communicate with an educated society in ways that are convincing to them. And I think that that's of different ways of communicating publicly, through whether it's through cell phones, through messaging systems that are reaching the population, because we're dealing with a highly educated population. And as the bodies begin to return, the official narrative may begin to be more questioned. And for those of you who have been supporters of democracy before, they need to keep getting access to information.
I would also add that probably the empowerment, exactly through the information of the best part of the Russian society, is important, particularly if you credit the society with a positive potential and capacity to, transform and build a civilized and democratic society. So if we send these positive messages and, empowering this way the alternative narrative and alternative sort of concept of identity of Russian people, I think that will be also helpful.
I think it's important, following up on what Leila says, that we differentiate between people and the government.
Government, yeah.
And not say all Russians are bad, as some people are these days.
Do Western leaders do this enough? I mean, do we send enough signals that,
no,
in fact,
I don't think so. No, we haven't been doing it for a long time.
Right. Okay. So if we're going to say that Russia can never be a democracy, and then it's actually it becomes some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. Okay. So Leila, I take a very good point from you, which is that, Western delegations who come to Baku should not only meet the government, okay, should treat the opposition at least like it exists. So that would be a step. I think the second step was suggested by our friend Gerald Knaus in a talk we had a month ago, because he and European Stability Initiative have actually been instrumental in unraveling a corrupt network within the Council of Europe, who had taken monetary favors from Azerbaijan regime in order not to vote a resolution condemning lack of freedom of the press in Azerbaijan. So I think this is another important thing. This regime corrupt institutions of democracy themselves in the West. And we have evidence on this. Can we do something more? I mean, we also know the Manafort case and other cases which have been coming out. Do we do enough about this? Do we do enough to expose the corruption in our own ranks? The fact that all this was possible because for years, these people could buy key persons in the Western establishment.
I've always said it takes two to tango. And so I think we also need not just prosecution of Manafort, but others who have evaded the law to serve as enablers. And if you had one or two investigations like this, it would lead to a greater cleanup in the professional community.
Any final word? We are approaching the end of our time here.
I would like just to add that I'm not in exile anymore in terms of, after 7 years in exile, I was let in the country recently. So I just made my trip a month ago, which is a good indication that there is apparently softening towards the, NGOs, and NGOs are perceived as very important institution of the country. So there is a law on NGO at the moment, the draft law, which is being discussed. So maybe there will be some, legal improvement there. It's hard to say, but, let's hope. I consider that, this situation in Kazakhstan, maybe even insecurity in Russia, this is all and softening in Azerbaijan. It might be explained by these very revolutionary sort of changes in terms of the entering the energy transition era, because many of these dictatorships and authoritarian regimes probably already feel that with this new energy transition era, they will lose their major source of support and base, the oil and gas revenues. It's not, of course, going to come immediately and very quickly, but at least there might be some sort of sense of insecurity.
I have something else I'd like to add. First, after the independence of the Baltic states, there were many Balts who were in exile who came back to work and build the democracies in those countries. And I think there are many democratic Russians who've left over the years and are leaving now, and they do not see this as something permanent. They think of this as when there's an opening, they'd like to come back and help create a more democratic society. So the example has been there in other post-Soviet states. I mean, Russia is larger, but there is a precedent for this, and a successful precedent. And secondly, I think that as we think about cutting off Russia, there's some things that we need to do to think about for the good of the world that are coming forward. And one of the great problems that Russia faces in the future is an environmental disaster in Siberia and a large part of its territory, as the permafrost is melting, and that the underneath the top levels is melting for 40,000 years, letting off methane that is going to be exacerbating our problems of global warming. And this is a problem not just for Russia, which is going to be ground zero for this, but for the rest of the international community. And just as we think about how we need to be addressing the Amazon as the lungs of the universe, of our global world. We also need to be thinking about how, at some point, as this problem gets worse in a very short number of years, how we're going to be engaging with Russia on this. So isolation financially is important, but there's certain issues that for the good of the world, we all need to be engaging on together. And we need to remember that as we think about how do we go forward with Russia.
I also wanted to add one little thing about the perception of the threat from our post-Soviet autocrats. I mean, at the moment, as I can judge, the most merciless treatment is exposed to displayed towards the people who were supporting opposition with money, financially supporting opposition. So these are businessmen, small businessmen, and they are treated absolutely horribly in the prisons. They're not being amnestied. So I think that's where our governments see the major threat coming, the financial support of the dissidents and, dissent. So that's just a little comment on the...
Yes, but you know very well that it was very complicated in the last years to provide any financial support to anybody in Belarus or in Russia. I mean, this has become a real adventure. Still, I know that it was done. I know that it was done. And that's probably another thing which enraged Putin. In Putin's mind, he's absolutely sure that what happened in Belarus is entirely a fabrication and an engineering of the Western democracy promotion industry. He's convinced we paid all those protesters against Lukashenko and there was nothing spontaneous. I mean, that's obviously part of not only of his narrative, but that's what he sincerely believes. So, I mean, I return to the question, what can we do to help? Surely we should financially support this nascent opposition, but how to do it in a way which doesn't, put them at risk, both reputationally and actually physically. Louise, you meant to say a final word and then we really have to conclude.
I just think that information is power, and that's financially, we may not be able to transfer money, but it was certainly done during the Soviet era in very successfully in surreptitious ways. And we may be back to that as we're back to the Soviet era in so many aspects of contemporary Russian life.
Yes, you're right. Information was certainly powerful. The reason Ukraine is still there, despite the tragedy that we're witnessing, is that apparently very important information came to them in the first 2-3 days. They were really helped by their Western allies, and this information allowed them to defend the countries in the first 72 hours. And now we are already talking a very, very different game. I mean, of course, it is horrible, but they're still there. And, for them it mattered because they knew they were going to be invaded and they considered that they will still stand, stand for democracy, basically. This is why it is so impressive about this. All right, thank you very much, both of you. Thanks our public. We will resume our discussion about democracy promotion and if it is at all possible in the new times with the Freedom House president in about a month's time from now on. Meanwhile, with my regret that people did not really use the chat, I will end this conversation. The Democracy Promotion Series are just 1 hour. Maybe it's my fault that I didn't reinforce this at the beginning of this conversation. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice evening and do what you can. Do what you can. This will be enough if we all pull our weight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.